Let's first break down the nervous system as a whole. It can be broken down into the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system makes up the spinal cord and brain. The peripheral nervous system makes up all the nerves outside the spinal cord and brain, and that can be broken down further into the somatic and autonomic branches. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary muscle movement, as well as delivers sensory information from the periphery to the brain. The autonomic nervous system controls involuntary responses, and it can be broken down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system comprises the responses secondary to a stressful or a dangerous situation, and for that reason, it is commonly referred as the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system comprises the responses that occur when the body is at rest, and for that reason, it is commonly referred as the rest and digest state. The final component to talk about is the enteric nervous system. This is the intrinsic nervous system of the GI tract. It's commonly lumped in the autonomic nervous system, but it actually has its own reflexes for GI function. It can be influenced by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but it doesn't need it. It still has its own reflexes. Today, we're going to be focusing, though, on the sympathetic and parasympathetic components. Let's first start with the sympathetic nervous system. As discussed earlier, it is commonly referred to as the fight or flight response. It is all the responses that are generated secondary to a stressful or a dangerous situation. So when you guys think of the sympathetic nervous system, I want you to think of revving up all of the critical actions needed for immediate survival. This will include increasing heart rate and cardiac output to increase perfusion to muscles and vital tissues and organs. The airways are also going to be dilated, the pupils will dilate, glucose production will increase to meet the needs of increased metabolism. There will be increased diaphoresis or sweating secondary to increased metabolism, along with some other reasons. Hypertension may also occur secondary to that increased cardiac output. The sympathetic nervous system also constricts the peripheral vasculature, and that's going to lead to increased blood pressure as well. On the flip side, all of the non-critical actions needed for immediate survival will be downregulated, and this will include salivation, lacrimation, digestion, defecation, and urination. Let's now compare this to the parasympathetic nervous system. Now remember, we said the parasympathetic nervous system is all of the responses that occur secondary to when the body is at rest, and for that reason, it is commonly referred to as the rest and digest response. So when you guys think of the parasympathetic nervous system, I want you to think of revving up all of those non-critical actions needed for immediate survival while downregulating or normalizing those critical actions needed for survival. So for example, heart rate is going to decrease or normalize, and this in turn will decrease the cardiac output. The bronchi will constrict, the pupils will constrict. On the flip side, some of those non-critical actions such as salivation, lacrimation, digestion, urination are going to be increased. So you can see that the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system are essentially the opposite of one another. The last thing I want to mention is that the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are continuously producing a response. It is not just one or the other. However, this balancing act can be tipped in one direction or the other, depending on the current physiological state of that individual and depending on what's going on around their surroundings or environment. So now let's go ahead and talk about each system step by step, starting with the sympathetic nervous system. The axons of sympathetic neurons arise from the central nervous system in the thoracolumbar region, specifically T1 through L2. These preganglionic neurons are very short and terminate quickly at the sympathetic chain, also referred to as the sympathetic trunk or paravertebral ganglia. Collections of neuronal cell bodies called ganglia are located here. The neuronal cell bodies that originate at the sympathetic chain and terminate on target organ or effector tissues are called postganglionic neurons. These are much longer than the axons of the preganglionic neurons. We're going to talk about the specific neurotransmitters that take place in each of these synapses in a moment, but you can see that the preganglionic neurons in blue release acetylcholine, while the postganglionic neurons in red, they release norepinephrine. This will ultimately generate all of those sympathetic responses that we just discussed a few moments ago. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second as we walk through this step by step. So the first step is what occurs between the pre and postganglionic neurons. And in order to do this, let's zoom in on that synapse. So you can see on the left we have preganglionic neurons, and on the right we have a postganglionic neuron. An action potential will be generated through the preganglionic neuron, which will release acetylcholine onto nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. Preganglionic neurons are commonly referred to as cholinergic fibers because they release acetylcholine. Once that acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic cholinergic receptor on the postganglionic neuron, an action potential will be generated through that postganglionic neuron, which then takes us to our next step of what occurs between the postganglionic neuron and the target organs. Let's zoom in on this synapse. The postganglionic neuron is on the left and the target organs are on the right. An action potential will be generated through the postganglionic neuron, releasing norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors of target organs. This will ultimately produce the sympathetic response that we discussed earlier. Before we discuss each of those responses, let's summarize the neurotransmission that we just discussed. So sympathetic activity starts in the central nervous system, and then this information travels as an action potential through the preganglionic neurons that arise in the thoracolumbar region. They are short and terminate quickly at the sympathetic chain, where they release acetylcholine onto nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the postganglionic neurons. This will then generate an action potential through the postganglionic neuron, which will then release norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors of the target organ. This will then generate that sympathetic response. If the adrenergic receptors on the heart are activated, then heart rate will increase. If the adrenergic receptors in the GI tract are activated, then digestion decreases. There is one more thing I want to discuss, and that is preganglionic sympathetic neurons also terminate on the adrenal medulla. This will cause secretion of norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream. These catecholamines circulate through the bloodstream, and they too will activate adrenergic receptors in addition to the norepinephrine that is released by postganglionic neurons. This is particularly important in the lungs. Bronchodilation is a result of beta-2 adrenergic receptor activation. Beta-2 receptors have a much higher affinity for epinephrine than they do norepinephrine. So it's actually the circulating epinephrine that leads to bronchodilation more so than the norepinephrine. In fact, there are not many postganglionic neurons that terminate at the lungs. I'll be talking more about specifics with adrenergic receptors in future videos, but I just mainly wanted to point out that there are preganglionic sympathetic neurons that terminate on the adrenal medulla, which causes secretion of norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream. And then these catecholamines can also act on adrenergic receptors in addition to the norepinephrine released by postganglionic neurons. So now that we have a good understanding of the sympathetic nervous system, I would like to walk through the parasympathetic nervous system step by step, just like what we did with the sympathetic. The parasympathetic nervous system has preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, similar to the sympathetic. There are a couple differences, though, in the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system. The first being where they arise from the central nervous system. So remember, in the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons arose from the central nervous system in the thoracolumbar region. The preganglionic parasympathetic neurons arise from the central nervous system in the craniosacral regions. The cranial preganglionic fibers will leave the brain and brainstem through cranial nerves, and the cranial nerves that have parasympathetic fibers in them are cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. The second main difference of the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers is that their axons are much longer than those of the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic system. The preganglionic parasympathetic neurons terminate on postganglionic neurons that are located really close to the target organ, sometimes actually within the effector tissue itself. Now we're going to be talking about the neurotransmitters here in a second, but you can see that both the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. Once this neurotransmission occurs, all of those parasympathetic responses that we discussed earlier will be produced, and we'll talk about those in a minute as well. But let's walk through this step by step, starting with what occurs between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. And in order to do that, let's zoom in on that synapse. So on the left, we have the preganglionic neuron, and on the right, we have a postganglionic neuron. An action potential will be generated through the preganglionic neuron, which will then release acetylcholine onto nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the cell bodies of the postganglionic neuron. This sounds and looks familiar because it's the exact same thing that we saw in the sympathetic nervous system between pre- and postganglionic neurons. Once the acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic receptor, then an action potential will be generated through the postganglionic neuron, which will then bring us to the next step of what occurs between the postganglionic neuron and the target organs. And let's go ahead and zoom in on that synapse as well. So on the left, we have the postganglionic neuron, and on the right are all the target organs. An action potential will be generated through the postganglionic neuron, and acetylcholine will be released onto muscarinic receptors of the target organ. This stage is different than what we saw in the sympathetic nervous system. Remember there, the postganglionic neurons released norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors. Now we're seeing acetylcholine released onto muscarinic receptors. So the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons are cholinergic fibers, versus the postganglionic sympathetic neurons are adrenergic fibers. Let's now summarize the neurotransmission that occurs in the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic activity will originate in the central nervous system. This information will then travel as an action potential through the preganglionic neurons. The preganglionic neurons arise in the cranial sacral region, and their axons are much longer, and they terminate really close to their target organs. They then release acetylcholine onto nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons. This will then generate an action potential through those neurons, and they will release acetylcholine onto muscarinic cholinergic receptors of the target organs. This will produce that parasympathetic response. So for example, if the muscarinic receptors in the heart are activated, then bradycardia will occur. If the muscarinic receptors in the GI tract or bladder get activated, then digestion and urination increase. If the muscarinic receptors in the lungs get activated, then bronchoconstriction will occur. Now let's go ahead and bring together the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. We can see how they both have pre- and post-ganglionic neurons. We can see that the sympathetic preganglionic neurons arise in the thoracolumbar region, whereas the parasympathetic side arises in the cranial sacral regions. We can also see that the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system are much shorter than those of the parasympathetic nervous system. Both of the sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine onto nicotinic cholinergic receptors. The difference, however, is in the postganglionic neurons, where the sympathetic side releases norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors, and the parasympathetic side releases acetylcholine onto muscarinic receptors. I'm going to throw in some arrows here that discuss the responses. We've talked about this a couple of times now. Again, you can see that they're essentially the opposite of one another. And then the final thing I want to wrap this up with is basically a summary table that I put together that compares the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system.